Good morning, everyone, and you're very welcome to this event that is part of the LAI Public Library section of online conferences for 2020 and 2021. My name is Jane Burns, and I'm coming to you today from the fabulous Dunboyne Library in County Meath, which also happens to be my public library. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a member of the LAI Executive Council, and I've been a library and information professional for over 25 years, working in a variety of different environments. More recently, I have moved into academic management at Athlone Institute of Technology. Our guest today is Richard Ovenden. Richard is the director of the Bodlean Libraries, where he has held the senior executive position at the University of Oxford since 2014. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and the Royal Society of Arts. Richard is a member of the American Philosophical Society and treasurer of the Consortium of European Research Libraries. He is the president of the Digital Preservation Coalition. Richard was awarded the OBE by the Queen in 2019. He's the author of this fantastic book, Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack. I'm so excited, Richard, to talk to you today about this wonderful publication. But first, I'd like to ask you a few questions.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here and talking with you and with the library community here in Ireland. And I'm only sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person.
So, Richard, just to kind of start off, as someone who has a very successful and a progressive career, I'm hoping you can answer this two-part question. So the first being, could you give us an example of something that you perceived as a failure or a challenge during your career? And how did you manage that experience to help or hinder your progression?
Well, that's quite an interesting question. I think there were there have been several incidents like this throughout my career, both kind of at different kind of scales. I think there have been times where I should have pushed ahead in my professional development. There are points where I had the opportunity to take part in committees for the Library Association in the UK, as it was called then, and didn't take that opportunity, which I now regret. Or there are jobs that I applied for, which I was unsuccessful for at a time when I really wanted a move. And but I learned a lot through those processes, both, if you like, the path not taken because of my own insecurity or the lack of time that I devoted to my own professional development, or in the case of the jobs that I applied for and didn't get, I failed at the interview. I learned a lot from that process and I got better at it. The next time I applied, I was just that little bit better. I'd honed the application. I was a little bit more kind of together in the interview process.
So getting feedback helps you move to the next challenge then?
Getting feedback, I think those experiences of failure are really helpful if you take the chance to actually reflect on them. Why wasn't I successful? And there have been various kind of projects and things within my career where I've had to take kind of decisions, or I've gone down a particular path, and those haven't been successful for one reason or another either. And sometimes that's because I didn't put enough time into the planning ahead of time. Sometimes it's down to, my interaction with colleagues. I wasn't sufficiently clear in what I wanted to get out of a particular activity, or I wasn't sufficiently directive to members of staff to say, look, I really need you to do this by Friday.
Yeah.
And they thought, oh, well, he's not bothered about it. We can leave it till next week. So I think there are loads and loads of things that I've not been successful at, from that range of the kind of very personal to the kind of projects and service development. But I think taking the time to kind of reflect on it and listening to feedback, seeking feedback and hoping that you get honest feedback is absolutely invaluable. But I really do believe that the experiences that you have make you stronger as you go through life.
Yeah, and that's really great advice. And I like the approach of seeking feedback, reflect, and then re-engage. That's really helpful, particularly for new entrants to our profession.
Yeah. So there's a phrase which I use quite a lot these days, which is no is only a stop on the road to saying yes.
That's good advice. So, Richard, I'm going to be flipping between questions and the book because I absolutely love this book. I was so excited to finish it. And one of the concepts that I think particularly our readers and particularly our audience of librarians will find is that this concept of libraries as knowledge creators. So, I think there's particularly within the profession and also within the general public, is that we're controllers of information, we're these gatekeepers. But I really like this idea of being knowledge creators. And I see more and more in, especially our public libraries, but in our academic libraries, that this translation, we see it in different things like maker spaces, online digital curation. So do you have any ideas, and can you kind of see where things are going for this kind of, this area of knowledge creation?
I mean, I think I absolutely agree with you, and I think there are a whole kind of range of different aspects to this, and I think they kind of apply to libraries of all kinds. So you can see libraries providing the services, the supporting infrastructure, if you like, that allow others to create new knowledge, and that might just be a quiet place in a library to sit down and think and read a book and then write. And there have been loads of examples of, famous writers who started their careers sitting in a library with a pile of books and, a laptop or even just a notebook and getting on with things. And I don't think we should diminish that aspect of what we do. And I think things like maker spaces are just evolutions of that provision of the supporting environment. And I think that sort of environment for knowledge creation that libraries provide is absolutely kind of critical. And I think it's really important also that we capture the incidents where people have been able to create knowledge through their interaction with libraries. And that may be just the space, or it may be the support that people, librarians, give to those writers or film directors or local historians or whoever they may be. I think in the digital environment, there is a kind of an additional kind of aspect to that. And some of that is around the ability to use content that libraries can provide. So whether that they are licensed resources or things that we digitize and put online. And if we do that in the right way, if we make those resources as interoperable as they can be, so we make it easy for people to access them, if we put license arrangements in place that though that content can be reused easily, then we enable that knowledge creation to take place. But I think increasingly librarians themselves are the creators of that knowledge. And whether that's through digitization, whether that's through collecting in particular ways, and I think sort of deep and serious and thoughtful collecting, whether it's in the local studies section of a public library or in a big research library like the Bodleian, those have the power to change the world. Those collections can change the formation of disciplines. Those collections can change the way people in a local area think about their environment, think about their own place in society. They can influence young people by bringing them into contact with a past that may either be very challenging because it's difficult, or it may be that it actually alters a perspective on the past. So I think that aspect of knowledge creation where librarians, through their professional activities, are creating either the environment or the knowledge itself, We should be celebrating that, documenting it, telling people about it, because it's such a key thing that we do these days.
Yeah, and I like the approach, and I think we briefly touched on this earlier, but this whole involvement and access to our colleagues who are archivists and to archives, and the ability to provide access to things that, perhaps, the ordinary person, maybe they would never be able to see that, like a street map or some historical piece of information that's very relevant. So I love this idea, and I agree with you that, librarians working with a range of partners and library staff, particularly in public libraries, who are so knowledgeable in local areas, to be able to bring these artifacts or this archival material to life is really, really interesting. So I love that we run a whole gambit from maker spaces for college students to come up with new innovative products for people to have a better understanding of where they live.
Yeah, and I think we live in an age where the past is being re-examined and reinterpreted and looked at through a whole variety of new lenses, and whether that's triggered by things like Black Lives Matter, whether it's looking at the legacies of empire, particularly in my own country, or whether it's looking at gender, the role of women in society. We all have collections in our libraries that can tell a different story, and it's just that the time is now right, where there are so many aspects of the past that speak so directly and so powerfully to the present, and libraries and archives are in an absolutely critical position where we can help our communities to re-examine those pasts, and as we were saying earlier, to discover new knowledge about them, and to change the way that we think about ourselves as a result.
Just to move on a little bit, Richard, and I'm really so impressed with your, particularly the academic and the intellectualism that is all around, particularly the work that you do in the Bodleian in your whole career. But I'd like to ask you, what is your earliest memory of a public library when you were a child?
Well, that's going with my mum to the public library in my hometown, Deal in Kent, in the southeast corner of Kent, just a few miles along the coast from Dover, a very small, sleepy town on the coast, and going into the children's section and picking children's books and taking them home and reading them. And that process began, I don't know exactly when, my mum can't remember when, but when I was 3 or 4. And then it's basically not stopped since then. And the library moved. It moved to a new site when I was a teenager, maybe 11 or 12, 13, something like that. And it had more space, and it was at that point that I would start to go by myself. And I think that was a kind of very, very important and transformational thing for me in my growth as a person, to have access to Deal Public Library. And it really began with fiction, just borrowing books that blew my horizons apart. And it was science fiction. So like lots of teenage boys, I read J.R.R. Tolkien, but I that was through friends, school friends, who passed that book to me. But in the library, I read, science fiction, particularly in my middle years as a teenager. And then as I got a bit older, I began to be a little bit more ambitious in reading kind of literary classics, and then also music. I grew up in a house, although my parents were very kind of incredibly pro education. It was a working class house. We didn't have many books in my home. And in terms of music, we had Frank Sinatra, and that was pretty much it. And there was one bit of classical music, which was an ancient recording of Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. But in Deal Public Library, there was a whole section of vinyl that you could borrow of, classical music and jazz. And, I started to expand my horizon in that way as well. So, I would not be sitting here talking to you now if it wasn't for my local public library. and foolscap newspapers, the weekly magazines like the Times Literary Supplement. All of these things were absolutely fundamental in, like I said, blowing my horizons really very, very widely apart.
And I find for most people, their first experience of library is as a child in a local public library. And if it's positive, that's something that stays with them for life. And that's something that I'm quite proud of my colleagues here in Ireland. We have a fantastic public library system. And there's so many activities to bring people in, to bring students in, to bring not just students, but young people, children, to get them in and get them started very early on. So it's fantastic. And it's good to see how these stories evolve over life. And they can make a difference.
They absolutely make a difference. I'm living proof of it. And
I'd be the same.
what really troubles me is certainly in the UK, is the kind of continued attrition of the public library system, and the effect that that has on the life chances of those who are not from what I am now, a kind of middle class person. And it really, really concerns me. There's been 1,000 libraries lost over the last 10 or 12 years in the UK. I mean, it's an absolute scandal. And, we should be ashamed of ourselves as a society for letting this happen.
Yes, it can be quite scary. So, Richard, the other thing that I want to move on to is, this fabulous career as a librarian and so much research. But how did you get the move into writing, particularly, say, a book like this? What kind of started you in that?
Well, that's a good question. So there's kind of a long-term answer to that and a very kind of short-term one. So I've always been interested in writing and doing research. I studied history at university and got sort of moved into the kind of special collections world. So rare books and manuscripts and archives and things like that. So doing that kind of job, I mean, doing all library jobs involves involves research, and doing special collections was good for me because it involved my history research. So I, from kind of early on, and I had particular friends who were librarians who did the same thing and kind of encouraged me and supported me through that, which was to write about the history of publishing, the history of collecting, the history of libraries, the history of printing. And so I wrote short articles, at first in really quite obscure publications.
Yes, most people,
and then sort of more a big, over the years they got more kind of polished, I guess, and the publications got a bit more prestigious, Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press, Edinburgh. But they were really writing for quite a kind of niche audience. But I was used to the process of research. I was used to the process of peer review, all of those kind of things, being edited. And I'd also been an editor of a library journal myself as well. So I had experience on both sides of the.
So you see the business from both sides.
I'd seen that. Absolutely. And then I think the kind of key thing for me was beginning to write for a much broader audience. And that began by writing some book reviews in national newspapers. And, I really enjoyed actually trying to kind of interpret, and these were really about the kind of digital world, and being able to write in a way that reached people outside of the profession primarily. And then a number of triggers brought me to the book, and one in particular was the Windrush scandal in the UK, which in 2018 I read a newspaper report that highlighted the destruction of landing records in the Home Office of the Windrush era generation, at the same time that the so-called hostile environment that the same government department was instigating on our fellow citizens who'd been encouraged to come and live in the UK after World War II, the so-called Windrush generation. And that the same records, the same evidence that those individuals could use to defend themselves had been destroyed deliberately by the Home Office. And I felt that this was a scandal that really encompass the value of knowledge and the preservation of knowledge for society, for the rights of individuals, and for the health of society as a whole. And I wrote a piece in the Financial Times, which got published, an op-ed, and the next day a publisher wrote to me and said, this would make a very interesting book. And here we are now,
Here we are now.
talking about it.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me about the book was, like history really does repeat itself. We see these, especially, particularly in your book, you highlight the vulnerability of libraries and archives, particularly when there's unrest, when there's destruction, when there's war. And even we see this more, I think, in the present day, this kind of lack of critical thinking and fake news. What do you think about this? And how did it kind of really steer you in the way that the book is basically presented in this socio-economic historical way?
Well, I wanted to get that kind of broad sweep, partly because I'm a historian, so that's the lens through which I look at things going on today, but also because the stories, the individual case, the book is really framed around a number of case studies, and those case studies I try to go into some detail. They're not exhaustively detailed, but they give you enough to tell you that actually the stories are really quite interesting. And I was really interested in doing the research. Some of them I knew about a great deal from my own reading and research. Some of them I didn't know anything about, particularly the ancient world. So, that was a great opportunity. I loved reading about ancient Mesopotamia and the Library of Alexandria and the Hellenistic world. And, it was really eye-opening. And I saw lots and lots of parallels. So I thought that sort of historical sweep would be a way of bringing the general reader in, but also to keep trying to kind of frame those things in a way that related to the contemporary world that we live in as much as possible. And I think that you're absolutely right. There are these kind of issues that repeat themselves. There's the fragility of knowledge that we need to be reminded of, the complacency that society, from time to time has been, wallows in, and look what happens as a result. The centrality of the preservation of knowledge to people, to communities, and those cases where people risked and lost their lives to preserve documents and books and libraries and archives. I mean, they're incredibly powerful stories, and we need to be reminded of those, I think, to inspire our profession today. And then the sort of, as you say, the continuation of these stories into the present world, into the digital arena, where actually we need to move these kind of lessons into public policy, and we need to influence our governments, our decision makers, our public policy thinkers, to say, let's have enough of this. Let's sort these issues out. Let's address them for the sake of democracy, for open societies, for the health of communities and the rights of citizens.
One of the things that I like, particularly when I read books and when I read anything, is I love to I always try to imagine what the author's thinking, how are they coming together, and how are they bringing the story to life. So I loved and I love history as well. So I loved that I felt like it was almost like on a history timeline. But I found myself, particularly when I got to chapter 4, really now becoming aware of the maritime metaphors. So that was my favorite chapter, and it was the arc to save learning. And I loved that all along the way. It was like I felt I was bobbing along, if you've ever moved on water. So I was just wondering if that was kind of this whole idea of discovery and maritime metaphors, was that a planned, or is that something that's subliminal that's come into your writing?
Not at all. It's only now you say it, just as we're speaking, that it strikes me that was there at all. I guess, I come from a long line of mariners. So, my granddad, my dad, my brother all served in the Royal Navy, and before them in various kind of maritime. And I grew up on the sea.
So it's in the DNA, and that has come through in the writing quite a bit.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, it's nice of you to spot it. Yeah. And you know, my wife grew up in a Scottish Hebridean island, and so we go to islands a lot. And the ferries are the kind of the most fun thing about the whole trip.
They are really. So, Richard, one of the things that I had asked to consider, and if you've had time to prepare, is if would you do a reading of a passage from the book, and then it's just maybe one or two more questions.
Yeah, I'd absolutely enjoy that very much. So I'm going to begin. It's from the introduction actually, so it's quite early on in the book, and it's a couple of pages. It's about 3 pages, but I'm going to cut a few bits out,
Okay.
just so that we don't take up too much time with it. But anyway, so here goes. I'm lucky enough to work in one of the world's greatest libraries. Formerly founded in 1598 and first opened to readers in 1602, the Bodleian in Oxford has enjoyed a continuous existence ever since. Working in an institution like this, I'm constantly aware of the achievements of past librarians. The Bodleian today is well over 13 million printed volumes in its collections, plus miles and miles of manuscripts and archives. The collections are housed in 40 buildings dating from the 15th to the 21st century, which have a fascinating history in themselves. My own education up to the age of 18 was transformed by being able to use my hometown of Deal's public library. In that building, I discovered the joys of reading. And at first, this was escape through science fiction, especially Isaac Asimov, Brian Aldiss, and Ursula Le Guin. And then I read Thomas Hardy and D.H. Lawrence, but also authors from beyond Britain, Hermann Hesse, Gogol, Colette, and many more. I found I could borrow vinyl records and discovered there was more to classical music than Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, Beethoven, Vaughan Williams, Mozart. I could read the serious newspapers and the Times Literary Supplement, all for free, crucially important as my family were not wealthy and there was little money to buy books. The library was and is run by local government, free for users of the majority of its services, and funded from local taxation under legal provisions that were first set out by the Public Libraries Act of 1850. There was political opposition to the idea at the time. As the bill worked its way through Parliament, the Conservative MP Colonel Sibthorpe was sceptical of the importance of reading to the working classes on the grounds that he himself did not like reading at all and hated it while at Oxford. The system of public libraries that the Act inaugurated replaced a patchwork of endowed libraries, parish libraries, collections in coffee houses, fishermen's reading rooms, as well as subscription libraries and book clubs, which were products of the age of improvement and the concept of useful knowledge. Libraries were a key part of a wider movement to broaden education for the benefit of the individual, but also for society as a whole. A century or more later, Sylvia Pankhurst, the inspirational champion of women's rights, wrote to the director of the British Museum requesting admission to the reading room of the library, as I desire to consult various government publications and other works to which I cannot obtain access in any other way. At the foot of her letter of application, she cited her object of study, to obtain information on the employment of women. The Public Libraries Act made it possible for local authorities to institute public libraries and pay for them through rates, as local taxation was then called. But this system was entirely voluntary. It was not until 1964 that the Public Libraries and Museums Act made it a duty for local authorities to provide libraries, and the system retains a strong place in the general consciousness today as a cherished service, part of the national infrastructure for public education. Libraries and archives share the responsibility of preserving knowledge for society. This book has been written not just to highlight the destruction of those institutions in the past, but also to acknowledge and celebrate the way librarians and archivists have fought back. It is through their work that knowledge is passed down from one generation to the next, preserved so that people and society can develop and seek inspiration from that knowledge. In a famous letter of 1813, Thomas Jefferson compared the spread of knowledge to the way one candle is lit from another. He who receives an idea from me, wrote Jefferson, receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. Libraries and archives are institutions that fulfill the promise of Jefferson's taper, an essential point of reference for ideas, facts, and truth. The history of how they have faced the challenges of securing the flame of knowledge and make it possible to enlighten others is complex. Individual stories in this book are instructive of the many ways knowledge has been attacked throughout history. Jefferson's taper remains alight today thanks to the extraordinary efforts of the preservers of knowledge, collectors, scholars, writers, and especially the librarians and archivists who are the other half of this story.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. That's really lovely, and it's always nice to hear the author's voice, you know. So I guess to kind of come to almost to the end of our interview, I'd like to ask you, what do you think the future holds for Richard Ovenden? Is there another book in the making?
Oh, well, I hope so. I hope so. I think one of the problems has been in the pandemic, there's been hardly any time to think about the next book, although my agent is encouraging me. And also I'm really enjoying doing kind of events like this to promote the book, and the paperback version comes out in May, and there are various foreign translations which are appearing in the next few months. The first one, the Italian translation, comes out next in March. So I'm enjoying doing all of those things, talking to librarians and readers and other groups. And I'm only really sorry that I'm not able to do it in person. I'd love to come to Ireland and talk to you all in the flesh, as it were. But I am thinking about a book about librarians, actually, about the individuals who've kind of shaped our profession and therefore helped to shape society as a result. And so I'm kind of gathering a few sort of, again, the kind of case study approach, a list of names that might form the basis of the next book. So any ideas, feel free to share, you know, and they don't have to be kind of famous figures.
No, it's just people who make a difference. Yeah.
People who've really made a difference, have really been kind of, you know, powerful in their local setting, in their local library, their local community, in the special interest group that they've forged, or who've been pathfinders, you know, in different ways.
Yes. Well, Richard, I have really enjoyed talking to you. I have absolutely loved this book. I'm delighted that it's coming out in paperback, and we will have an end to this pandemic, and we would love to have you visit us here in Ireland. So thank you very much for your time, and we really wish you every luck and success in all of your future endeavours. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all the librarians in Ireland who do such important, essential and significant work. So it's been a real pleasure being here and talking with you today.
So thank you very much, Richard, for taking the time to meet with me today to tell us all about your fabulous career and about this wonderful book, Burning the Books. And we do wish you every luck and success in all of your future endeavors. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for inviting myself and Richard to talk to you today. And especially thank you to our colleagues in the LAI Public Library section for organizing this event.